5 seconds. That's all it took. A 74-year-old man with a cane in one hand and grease under his fingernails that hadn't been there in 20 years leaned toward a stuttering engine, closed his eyes, and said, "Number 4 cylinder. Distributor contacts bent inward about 0.02. You're getting spark, but it's jumping late." The 3 young mechanics standing around that truck looked at him like he'd just spoken a dead language. One of them laughed. One of them turned back to the engine like the old man wasn't even there. And the third one, the crew chief, the one who thought he knew everything about everything, said, "Okay, Grandpa. Thanks for the tip." He said it the way you talk to a child who tells you they saw a dinosaur in the backyard. That old man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, leaning on his cane in the morning sun, waiting. Because he'd heard that tone before. He'd heard it from lieutenants fresh out of West Point who thought a manual was the same thing as experience. He'd heard it from depot commanders who couldn't tell a crankshaft from a camshaft, but signed off on inspection reports like they'd built the engine themselves. He'd heard it his entire career, and every single time the engine proved him right and the doubters wrong. If you've ever watched someone get dismissed for how they look instead of what they know, type the word respect in the comments right now. Because what happened next at that restoration show changed every single person who witnessed it. The annual Military Vehicle Preservation Association show in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was the kind of event that drew 2 very different crowds. There were the historians and the hobbyists, older men mostly, who came to walk among the machines that had carried them, or their fathers or their grandfathers through wars that shaped the century. They touched the steel with reverence. They read the placards with the quiet recognition of people who understood that these weren't museum pieces. They were survivors, same as the men who'd driven them, and then there were the restoration crews, younger, louder, confident in the way that people are confident when they've learned something from YouTube tutorials and forum posts, and think that makes them experts. They wore matching shop shirts with embroidered names and sponsor patches. They had toolboxes that cost more than some of the vehicles on display. They talked fast and moved with the easy swagger of men who'd never been tested by anything more serious than a missed deadline. The centerpiece of that year's show was a 1968 M35A2, the legendary deuce-and-a-half, a 2.5-ton cargo truck that had been the backbone of American military logistics for decades. This particular truck had been pulled from a motor pool graveyard in Alabama, dragged onto a flatbed, and hauled north by a crew of 3 young mechanics who'd spent the better part of 18 months bringing it back from the dead. They'd rebuilt the multi-fuel engine from the block-up. They'd sourced new bushings and gaskets from a surplus dealer in Pennsylvania. They'd repainted the body in the correct shade of olive drab, number 34087, and they'd stenciled unit markings on the bumpers that were historically accurate down to the font spacing. On paper, it was a masterpiece. On the show field, under the August sun, with a crowd gathered around to watch the big reveal, it was a disaster. Because the engine wouldn't run right. It started on the first crank. The multi-fuel engine caught, belched a cloud of black smoke, and settled into an idle that was wrong. Not obviously wrong to most people. To the casual observer, it sounded like what they expected a 50-plus-year-old military truck to sound like. Rough, heavy, diesel-throated. But to anyone who'd ever worked on one of these engines for real, the rhythm was off. There was a hesitation in the firing order, a subtle miss that showed up as a faint shudder in the exhaust note every 3rd or 4th cycle. The kind of thing that a computer diagnostic would catch in milliseconds, but that human ears needed training and experience to identify. The crew chief, a 32-year-old named Derek, heard it. He heard it, and he didn't like it, but he couldn't place it. He revved the throttle, and the miss got worse. At higher RPMs, the shudder became a stumble, and twice in the first 5 minutes the engine nearly stalled out completely, catching itself at the last second with a coughing lurch that made the whole chassis rock on its springs. Derek killed the engine, and the 3 of them went to work. They checked the fuel lines first because that was the obvious place to start. The multi-fuel engine on the M35A2 was designed to run on anything from diesel to jet fuel to gasoline in a pinch, and the fuel system was notoriously finicky about air bubbles and contamination. They bled the lines, they checked the filters, they pulled the primary fuel filter apart right there on the show field and inspected it under a flashlight. Clean. They reassembled it and tried again. Same miss, same stumble, same shudder that felt like the engine was trying to clear its throat and couldn't quite manage it. The crowd that had gathered for the triumphant first start was beginning to drift. A few people offered suggestions. Check the glow plugs, look at the injection timing, Maybe there was water in the fuel. Derek nodded politely at each suggestion the way people nod when they've already decided they're smarter than everyone around them. His two crew members, a 26-year-old named Tyler and a 29-year-old named Marcus, exchanged glances but kept working. They trusted Derek. He'd led the restoration. He'd sourced the parts. He'd made the calls. If he said the fuel system was the problem, then the fuel system was the problem, and they just hadn't found the specific issue yet. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, and the heat coming off the asphalt showfield turned the area around the deuce-and-a-half into a furnace. Derek had sweat through his shop shirt. Tyler had burned his forearm on the exhaust manifold and was working with a rag wrapped around it like a bandage. Marcus was on his back under the truck, checking the fuel lines for the third time, when a shadow fell across the engine bay and a voice said, "That's not fuel, that's ignition." The three of them looked up. Standing at the front bumper of the M35A2 was an old man, 74 years old, though he looked older. He was thin the way that men get thin when their bodies have been slowly surrendering muscle mass for decades, not wasted but diminished, like a photograph that's been left in the sun too long and lost some of its contrast. He wore khaki trousers that were clean but faded, a plaid short-sleeve button-down shirt, and a ball cap that said nothing on it, just plain navy blue, the kind you buy at a gas station. He had a cane in his right hand, a wooden one with a rubber tip that had been worn smooth on one side from years of use. His left hand was in his pocket. His face was weathered, deeply lined, with pale blue eyes that sat behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked like every other old man at the show, a retiree, a spectator, someone's grandfather tagging along for the afternoon. Derek straightened up from the engine bay and looked at the old man with the expression that young men sometimes wear when they're trying to be polite. But their body language says, "Go away." "We appreciate the help, sir, but we've got it under control." The old man didn't move. He stood there with his head tilted slightly to one side and his eyes weren't on Derek. They were on the engine. Specifically, they were on the distributor assembly on the right side of the block, and there was something in the way he looked at it that was different from curiosity. It was recognition. It was the way a surgeon looks at a body on the table before the first incision, not wondering, not guessing, but reading. "You've been chasing fuel for the last hour," the old man said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of clarity that comes from decades of giving instructions in noisy environments. "It's not fuel. Your injectors are fine. Your lines are clean. I can tell because there's no black smoke on deceleration, and your exhaust color's consistent. What you've got is a spark timing issue on one cylinder, and if you listen, really listen, you can hear it." Derek crossed his arms. Tyler stopped what he was doing with the rag on his arm. Marcus slid out from under the truck and stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. They were all looking at the old man now, and the dynamic had shifted just slightly, the way it does when someone speaks with enough specificity that you can't dismiss them quite as easily as you dismissed them 10 seconds ago. "With all due respect, sir," Derek said, and every time someone starts a sentence with those words, it means the opposite is coming. "This is an LDS-465 multi-fuel engine. It doesn't have a traditional distributor system like a civilian vehicle. The injection system handles the timing, so with all due respect, I think you might be thinking of a different engine." There was a pause. The old man looked at Derek for a long moment, and something passed across his face. Not anger, not offense, but something like patience. The kind of patience that comes from having corrected the same mistake so many times over so many years that it no longer frustrates you. It just makes you tired. "Son," the old man said, "I know exactly what engine this is. I've rebuilt 47 of them, not restored, rebuilt, in conditions you can't imagine and on timelines that would make your head spin. And I'm telling you, this particular engine, this one right here, has a timing issue on the number 4 cylinder. You can hear it if you know what you're listening for. There's a hesitation in the firing sequence that puts a lag between 3 and 5. It's subtle at idle, but it compounds under load, which is why you're getting that stumble at higher RPMs. The specificity of it stopped Derek cold. He didn't respond right away. Tyler looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the engine. The crowd that had started to thin out was thickening again, because there's nothing that draws people at a show like the scent of a confrontation, even a polite one. Derek recovered quickly. He was not the kind of young man who liked being corrected in public, and he was especially not the kind who liked being corrected by someone who looked like he should be sitting in a lawn chair instead of standing at an engine bay. "Look, I don't know who you are, sir, but we've been working on this truck for a year and a half. We know this engine. We've gone through it top to bottom. Every gasket, every seal, every bearing. If there was a timing issue, we would have found it during the rebuild." The old man nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something that developed after the rebuild. Sometimes a distributor contact can bend during installation if you're not careful about the sequence. Happens all the time. Happened to me more times than I'd like to admit when I was your age. It doesn't show up on a bench test because there's no vibration, no heat cycling. But once you run the engine for a while and everything expands and settles, that bent contact starts making intermittent contact and your timing on that cylinder drifts. It's not a big drift, a couple thousandths of an inch. But on a multi-fuel engine that's running a timing sequence as tight as this one, a couple thousandths is the difference between smooth and what you're hearing right now." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the old man said something that changed the trajectory of the entire conversation. "Start it up again. I just want to listen." There was a moment of hesitation. Derek looked at Tyler and Marcus, and some unspoken calculation took place. The kind where a man weighs his pride against his curiosity, and his frustration against his desperation. The truck was supposed to be the star of the show. People had come specifically to see it run. The restoration had been featured in a preview article in Military Vehicles magazine, and the editor was somewhere in the crowd with a camera. Every minute the deuce-and-a-half sat there sputtering and stalling was a minute of public humiliation that Derek could feel accumulating on his shoulders like wet sand. "Fine," Derek said. "Marcus, crank it." Marcus climbed into the cab and hit the starter. The multi-fuel engine turned over twice, 3 times, and then caught with that same rough, shuddering idle. The exhaust pulsed unevenly, a rhythm that was almost right but not quite, like a drummer who keeps losing the beat for a fraction of a second and then catching up. The old man leaned forward. He didn't put his ear to the engine. He wasn't that kind of theatrical. He just stood there, maybe 3 feet from the front grille, with his head tilted and his eyes closed and his mouth slightly open, and he listened. He listened the way that musicians listen, with his whole body, not just his ears. 5 seconds, maybe 7. Then he opened his eyes, straightened up, and pointed at the engine with the index finger of his left hand. He pointed with precision, not at the engine in general, but at a specific location on the right side of the block, about 2/3 of the way back. "Number 4, he said. "Pull the cap on your distributor assembly and check the contact for that cylinder. It's bent inward, not much. You probably can't see it with your eyes, but if you run your thumbnail across it, you'll feel the difference." Derek stared at him. The crowd was silent. There were maybe 40 people gathered around the truck now, some of them other restoration crews, some of them veterans, some of them families who'd wandered over to see what the fuss was about. In that silence, the misfire was suddenly obvious. Now that someone had named it, now that someone had said number 4 with that kind of certainty, you could hear it. The rhythm of the engine had a hole in it, a gap where the 4th cylinder's contribution should have been full and strong, but instead was weak and late, like a voice in a choir that keeps coming in half a beat behind everyone else. Tyler was already moving. He didn't wait for Derek's permission. He grabbed a screwdriver from the toolbox, leaned into the engine bay, and with Marcus still sitting in the cab with the engine running, he loosened the clips on the distributor cap and pulled it off. He peered inside. "I can't see anything wrong," he said. "Use your thumbnail," the old man repeated. "Run it across the contact for number 4. You'll feel a ridge where it's bent inward." Tyler reached in and did what the old man said. He ran his thumbnail across the contact and his hand stopped. His eyes went wide. He looked at the old man, then at Derek and said, "He's right. There's a bend. I can feel it. It's tiny, but it's there." The old man reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small flat-blade screwdriver, the kind that costs 50 cents at a hardware store, the kind that mechanics call a pocket screwdriver, and he held it out. "You don't need that. Just use your thumbnail, push it back. Gently, a little at a time, you'll feel it click into plane with the others." Tyler looked at Derek. Derek's face was a battlefield. There was embarrassment there and resistance and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. The fear of finding out that someone knows more than you do. That the thing you thought was your expertise is actually just the surface of something much deeper. Derek said nothing. Tyler bent the contact back with his thumbnail, feeling for the moment when the metal settled into alignment with the others. It took maybe 30 seconds. He replaced the distributor cap and clipped it down. "Try it now," the old man said. Marcus turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned over once, twice, and on the 3rd rotation it caught. and the sound that came out of that exhaust pipe was different. It was the sound that everyone who'd ever worked on one of these trucks knew in their bones. The deep, steady, full-throated rumble of an LDS 465, running on all cylinders, firing in perfect sequence, each power stroke landing exactly where it was supposed to with the precision of a metronome. The shudder was gone. The hesitation was gone. The stumble was gone. The deuce-and-a-half sat there on the show field and idled like it had just rolled off the assembly line at the White Motor Company in Cleveland in 1968. Like the last 56 years hadn't happened at all. Like time had folded in on itself, and this was a brand new truck waiting to be loaded and shipped to wherever the army needed it next. Marcus revved the throttle from the cab and the engine responded instantly, climbing through the RPMs with a smoothness that made the entire crowd go quiet. No miss, no stumble, no coughing lurch. Just pure, clean, mechanical power. The sound of 8,000 individual parts working together in exact harmony. Tyler stepped back from the engine bay. His mouth was open. He was looking at the old man like he was looking at something he couldn't explain. Something that existed outside the categories he'd built in his mind for how the world worked. Derek hadn't moved. He stood with his arms at his sides, and the expression on his face had changed. The embarrassment was still there, but the resistance was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, something that looked, if you were close enough to see it, like awe. The crowd reacted the way crowds react when something unexpected and impressive happens in a mundane setting. There was a ripple of applause, a few people whistled, someone near the back shouted something about the old man knowing his stuff, but the old man didn't acknowledge any of it. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't look around at the faces watching him. He just stood there, leaning on his cane, looking at the engine with an expression that was completely private. The expression of a man revisiting something he'd loved, something he'd been separated from, something he'd never expected to touch again. It was Marcus who spoke first. He'd climbed down from the cab and was standing next to Tyler, and he said what Tyler and Derek were both thinking but neither had said. "Sir, how did you know that? How did you hear that from 3 feet away?" The old man looked at Marcus, and for the first time something shifted in his demeanour. The guarded stillness softened, just a fraction, like a door opening a crack to let a sliver of light through. 51 years ago, he said, I was a motor pool sergeant at Long Binh, Republic of Vietnam. We had 62 deuce-and-a-halfs in our section, and every single morning I walked the line while the drivers warmed them up. I didn't use diagnostics. We didn't have diagnostics. I used these, he tapped his ear, and these. He held up his hands. I could tell you which truck had a problem and what the problem was before the driver even knew something was wrong. Not because I'm special. Because I listened to those engines every single day for 3 years, and after a while, you stop hearing the engine and you start hearing the machine. The whole machine, every bearing, every seal, every valve, every contact, they all talk to you if you're paying attention. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. It pressed down on the people standing around that truck, and in that silence the engine idled perfectly, its steady rhythm underscoring the old man's words like a heartbeat. Derek swallowed hard. He looked at the ground, then at the old man, and when he spoke, his voice was different. The confidence was gone. The swagger was gone. What was left was something younger and more honest, the voice of a 32-year-old man who had just realized that there were things in the world that couldn't be learned from a manual or a forum post or a YouTube tutorial. Things that could only be learned by standing in the heat and the dust and the danger, day after day, year after year, until the knowledge became part of your body. "Sir," Derek said, "I owe you an apology. I was dismissive. That was wrong." The old man shook his head. "No apology needed. I've been dismissed by better than you." He said it without malice, without edge. He said it the way you state a simple fact, like the sky is blue or the engine is running. But there was something underneath it, something that Marcus heard and Tyler heard, and even Derek heard. A lifetime of being underestimated, a lifetime of being looked past, a lifetime of carrying knowledge that the world had decided was obsolete simply because the man carrying it had gotten old. His name was Harold Grimes. Staff Sergeant Harold Grimes, United States Army, retired. He'd enlisted in 1970 at the age of 18, straight out of a 2-room house in rural Kentucky, where the plumbing was a hand pump in the yard, and the closest thing to a mechanic was his father, who kept a 1954 Ford pickup running with baling wire and hand-cut gaskets, and a vocabulary of profanity that could strip paint at 20 paces. Harold had never seen the inside of a proper garage before basic training, but he had something that no garage could teach. He had ears. He could hear things, not in any supernatural sense, nothing mystical or strange. He could hear the way machines sounded when they were working right, and more importantly, he could hear the specific, individual, unique way they sounded when they were working wrong. It was a gift that the army recognized immediately and exploited ruthlessly. They put him through the wheeled vehicle mechanic course at Fort Ord, and he graduated first in his class, not because he was the smartest or the most technically educated, but because he could diagnose a fault by sound alone while his classmates were still hooking up the test equipment. They sent him to Vietnam 9 months later. Long Binh was the largest military base in Vietnam, a sprawling complex that at its peak held over 50,000 personnel and enough vehicles to fill a small city. Harold's motor pool was responsible for maintaining the deuce-and-a-halfs that ran the supply convoys between Long Binh and the forward operating bases scattered across Third Corps. Those trucks were lifelines. They carried ammunition, food, water, medical supplies and mail. When a truck broke down on a convoy route, it didn't just mean a delay, it meant vulnerability. A stalled truck was a target. A convoy stopped on a road in hostile territory was a convoy in danger. Every minute that a truck sat disabled on a road was a minute that men were exposed to ambush, to mines, to mortar fire. Harold understood this in a way that went beyond intellectual comprehension. He understood it in his gut, in the place where fear lives, because he'd ridden those convoys. He knew what it felt like to hear the engine change its note and feel your stomach drop because you knew before anyone else in the truck knew, that something was wrong and the vehicle was about to become a 2.5-ton steel coffin sitting in the middle of a road with tree lines on both sides and the sun going down. That fear drove him. It made him obsessive. He spent his off hours in the motor pool, not because he was ordered to, but because every truck he fixed properly was a truck that wouldn't break down on a road where breaking down meant dying. He did 3 tours. By the end of the 3rd, he was the senior motor pool NCO at Long Binh, responsible for the maintenance of over 200 vehicles. He had a reputation that had spread beyond the base. Officers from other units would specifically request his assessment of their vehicle fleets. He was the man you called when the diagnostics came back clean but the truck still didn't sound right, because Harold Grimes could hear what the machines couldn't measure. He came home in 1976 and stayed in the army. He served at Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, Fort Campbell. He trained a generation of young mechanics, and he trained them the way he'd been trained, by the machines themselves. He'd take a new private, stand him next to a running engine and say, "Close your eyes. What do you hear?" And the private would say, "An engine, Sergeant." And Harold would say, "Wrong. You hear 8 cylinders firing in sequence. Now listen again. Which one is firing late?" Most of them couldn't hear it at first. Some of them never could. But the ones who learned, the ones who developed the ear, they became the best mechanics in the army, and they all traced it back to the same man, to Staff Sergeant Grimes standing next to a running truck in the motor pool at 0500 with a cup of coffee in his hand, and a look on his face that said, "Listen harder." He retired in 1996 after 26 years of service. No fanfare, no ceremony. He'd been offered a full military retirement event with a colour guard and speeches and the whole dress uniform formality, but he'd turned it down. He said he didn't need strangers telling him what his career had meant. He knew what it meant. Every truck that came back safe from a convoy, every mechanic he'd trained who went on to save lives by keeping machines running, every engine that started on the first crank because he'd done his job right, that was his ceremony. That was his honour. He moved to a small house outside of Muncie, Indiana, on a county road with no neighbours close enough to bother him, and a pole barn out back where he kept his tools, and occasionally worked on a small engine repair for someone in town. He lived quietly. He didn't join veterans' organisations. He didn't go to reunions. He didn't talk about Vietnam unless someone who'd been there asked him directly. And even then, he talked about the trucks, not the war. The trucks were what he loved. The war was what he'd survived. His wife Dolores had died in 2014, and after that the quiet got quieter. His daughter, who lived in Indianapolis, came down every other weekend and tried to get him to move closer to the city, but Harold refused. He had his house, he had his pole barn, he had his tools, he had the sound of engines in his memory, thousands of them, each one as distinct and individual as a human voice, and on the nights when the silence got too heavy, he'd go out to the pole barn and sit in the folding chair next to his workbench and close his eyes and listen to them one by one, running in his mind like a private symphony that only he could hear. He hadn't been to the Military Vehicle Preservation Association show in years. He'd gone a few times in the early 2000s with Dolores, back when it was still fun to walk the field and look at the old machines and remember. But after she died, the show felt different. The trucks were the same, but the experience of being there without her was a kind of loneliness that he couldn't quite articulate, and so he'd stopped going. This year, his daughter had convinced him. She'd seen the preview article about the restored deuce-and-a-half, and she'd printed it out and brought it to him on one of her visits. "Dad, look at this," she said. "They restored an M35, your truck." Harold had looked at the article and something had moved in his chest. Something old and deep and powerful, like a subterranean river that had been flowing in the dark for years, and suddenly found a crack in the rock. "It's not my truck," he said. But he went. He'd arrived early before the gates opened to the general public, because his daughter had called ahead and gotten him a veteran's pass that allowed early access. He'd walked the show field slowly, leaning on his cane, stopping at each vehicle to read the placard and look at the restoration work. He was impressed by some of it, and troubled by others. There was a beautiful Willys Jeep that had been restored to museum quality, but had the wrong carburetor for its year model, and Harold had to physically stop himself from saying something to the owner, because he knew that nobody wanted to hear it. There was an M151 Mutt that looked perfect on the outside but had aftermarket brake lines that were a safety hazard, and Harold had quietly mentioned it to one of the show officials, who thanked him and immediately forgot about it. And then he'd come to the deuce-and-a-half. He'd seen it from 50 yards away and his pace had changed. Not faster, he couldn't go faster, not with the cane and the hip that had been replaced 2 years ago, but more purposeful. He'd walk toward it the way you walk toward something you love, something you've missed, something that contains a part of your life that you thought was gone forever. And when they'd started the engine and he'd heard that miss, that hesitation, that gap in the firing order, it was like hearing an old friend's voice with a rasp in it that shouldn't be there, and he couldn't not say something. He physically could not stand there and listen to that engine suffer and not try to fix it. It would have been like watching someone choke and not reaching out a hand. Back at the truck, with the engine now running perfectly and the crowd still lingering, something unexpected began to happen. A man in the crowd, mid-60s stocky, wearing a Vietnam Veterans of America chapter jacket, had been watching the whole exchange. He stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of someone who's been waiting for the right moment. "Staff Sergeant Grimes," he said. Harold turned, and for a moment his face showed nothing, the blank look of a man who has been addressed by a stranger using a name he hasn't heard in decades. Then the man in the chapter jacket said, "I'm Bill Kovacs. I was a PFC in the 542nd Maintenance Company at Long Bin. You were my section sergeant. You probably don't remember me." The change in Harold's face was incremental but profound. The blankness gave way to search, his eyes moving across the man's features, comparing what he saw now to what was stored in a memory that was 50 years old. And then recognition arrived. Not all at once, but in pieces, like a photograph developing in a dark room. "Kovacs," Harold said. "You're the kid from Scranton who couldn't tell a torque wrench from a tire iron when you showed up." Kovacs laughed. A big, loud, surprised laugh that split the tension of the moment wide open. "That's me. That's the one. You told me I was the worst mechanic you'd ever seen, and that you were going to fix that or die trying." Harold allowed himself a small smile. "I fixed it." "You did," Kovacs said, and his voice caught. "You fixed it, Sergeant. You taught me how to listen, just like you taught everyone. And when that convoy got hit outside of Biennois in 73 and the lead truck took shrapnel in the engine block, I diagnosed the damage by ear while we were still under fire because you taught me what to listen for. We got that truck running again in 9 minutes, Sergeant. 9 minutes, in the middle of an ambush, because of what you put in my head." Harold said nothing. He stood very still, his hand on his cane, and the muscles in his jaw worked. Kovacs took a step closer. 5 men in that truck, Sergeant. 5 men who went home to their families because the truck moved instead of sitting there. The silence around the deuce-and-a-half was total. Even the engine seemed to be idling more quietly, as if the machine itself was listening. Then more people began to step forward. Not all at once, in ones and twos, the way tributaries feed into a river. An older woman in a sun hat who said her father had served under Harold at Fort Hood and had talked about him at the dinner table for 30 years. A man in his 50s who said he was a retired army mechanic who had been trained using a diagnostic listening method that he'd later learned was called the Grimes method by senior NCOs at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a systematic approach to engine fault diagnosis that Harold had developed, and that had been informally passed down through the Army maintenance community for decades without ever being officially documented because Harold had never written it down. A retired lieutenant colonel, who had been a young second lieutenant at Fort Campbell when Harold was the senior motor pool sergeant, and who said that Harold had once told him, respectfully but bluntly, that he was wrong about a maintenance scheduling decision, and that it was the first time anyone had ever told him he was wrong about anything, and it was the most important lesson in leadership he'd ever received. One by one they came forward, and one by one they told their stories, and the picture that emerged was not the picture of a man who fixed trucks. It was the picture of a man who had shaped an institution. Harold Grimes had spent 26 years doing a job that most people considered unglamorous, a job that didn't involve medals or parades or dramatic acts of battlefield heroism. He had spent 26 years keeping machines alive so that men could stay alive, and he had done it with an intensity and a skill that had rippled outward through the army like a stone thrown into a lake, touching lives and saving lives in ways that he had never known about and never sought recognition for. Derek stood at the edge of this gathering, watching and listening, and the transformation in him was visible to anyone paying attention. The cockiness that he'd worn like armour all morning had cracked and fallen away, and underneath it was something much younger and much more honest. The face of a man who was learning something about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between skill and mastery, between doing a thing and understanding it so deeply that it becomes part of who you are. When the stories subsided and the crowd began to settle into smaller conversations, Derek walked over to Harold. He stood in front of the old man and he didn't say anything for a moment, because he was trying to find the right words, and the right words were hard because they required him to say something that men his age and temperament find almost physically difficult to say. "Sergeant Grimes," Derek said, using the rank for the first time, "I want to apologise again, not just for being dismissive, for not recognising what you are. I've been working on these trucks for 5 years and I thought I knew them. I don't. I know parts of them. You know the whole thing. You know these machines the way I want to know them, and I was too arrogant to see it." Harold looked at Derek for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised everyone who was watching. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of cloth. He unfolded it, and it was a patch, an old faded Army motor transport patch, the kind that mechanics wore on their uniforms. It was worn soft and thin from decades of handling, and the stitching around the edges was starting to come apart. Harold held it out to Derek. "This was mine," he said. "I've been carrying it around for 28 years because I didn't have anyone to give it to. My daughter doesn't turn wrenches. My grandkids are in college for business degrees. I've been waiting to find someone who cares about these machines the way I cared about them." He pressed the patch into Derek's hand. "That miss you heard this morning, you heard it. You just didn't know what it was yet, but you heard it. That's the start. That's where it all starts. The ear comes first. Everything else follows." Derek looked at the patch in his hand and his eyes were shining and he nodded, and he couldn't speak, and Harold understood because he'd seen that look before, in the motor pools and the maintenance bays and the field repair stations across 3 decades. The look of a young man realizing that he's in the presence of something larger than himself. The show went on. The deuce-and-a-half ran flawlessly for the rest of the day, its engine filling the show field with that deep, perfect, rumbling idle that turned heads and drew crowds. Derek invited Harold to stay with them at the truck, and Harold accepted, leaning against the front bumper with his cane hooked over the mirror mount, answering questions from visitors and telling stories that made people laugh and go quiet by turns. He told them about the time a deuce-and-a-half ran over a mine outside of Cucci and blew the front axle completely off the frame, and the driver drove it 7 miles back to base on the rear axle alone because, as Harold put it, those trucks didn't know how to quit and neither did we. He told them about the mechanic who accidentally put aviation fuel in a truck that was supposed to run on diesel, and the engine ran better, which was how they discovered that the multi-fuel designation wasn't just a marketing gimmick. He told them about the night a convoy of 23 trucks got lost in a monsoon and ended up at a South Vietnamese army outpost, and the Vietnamese soldiers and the American soldiers spent the night sharing rice and cigarettes, and fixing a broken generator together, using gestures and drawings in the dirt because nobody spoke each other's language, and that in that moment, standing in the rain with grease on his hands and a wrench in his teeth, and a Vietnamese soldier holding a flashlight, Harold had understood something about the universality of mechanical work that had stayed with him for the rest of his life. The magazine editor who had come to photograph the restored truck ended up writing a different story. Instead of the piece he'd planned about the restoration process, he wrote about Harold, about the old mechanic who heard what the young mechanics couldn't, who fixed in 5 seconds what they couldn't fix in an hour, who carried an army patch in his back pocket for 28 years waiting for the right person to give it to. The story ran in the next issue with a photograph of Harold standing next to the deuce-and-a-half, his cane in one hand and his other hand resting on the hood, and the expression on his face in that photograph was the expression of a man who has come home, not to a place, to a purpose, to the thing that defined him and that he thought the world had forgotten, only to discover that the world hadn't forgotten at all. It had just been waiting for the right moment to remember. Derek kept the patch. He framed it in a shadow box alongside a photograph of Harold at Long Bin that Kovacs had dug out of a shoebox in his closet and mailed to him, and he hung it in his garage above his workbench where he could see it every time he picked up a tool. He also started doing something that his crew noticed, and that gradually changed the culture of their entire shop. Before starting any diagnostic work, before hooking up any equipment, before opening any manual, he would stand next to the engine, close his eyes and listen. Just listen. For 5 seconds, for 10, for however long it took. And if someone asked him what he was doing, he'd say, "I'm listening. A man taught me that the engine will tell you what's wrong if you pay attention. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Harold went home to Muncie after the show. He went back to his house on the county road with no neighbours close enough to bother him. He went back to his pole barn and his tools and the folding chair next to the workbench. But something was different now. The silence didn't feel as heavy. The chair in the pole barn didn't feel as lonely. Because out there in the world an engine was running right because he'd heard what was wrong. Young men were listening to machines the way he'd taught a generation of soldiers to listen. A patch that had lived in his back pocket for 28 years was hanging in a frame in a garage in Indiana, reminding someone every day that knowledge isn't something you get from a screen. It's something you earn with your hands and your ears and your time. And on quiet nights, when Harold sat in his pole barn and closed his eyes and listened to the engines running in his memory, there was a new one in the chorus now, a 1968 M35A2, restored by 3 young men who thought they knew everything, and learned that the most important things are taught by people who look like they have nothing left to teach. Some people carry medals, some people carry titles, some people carry the weight of things they did that the world will never see and never thank them for. Harold Grimes carried a sound, the sound of an engine running right, the sound of a machine that would bring someone home safe, the sound of 26 years of service reduced to something you couldn't hang on a wall or print on a certificate, a gift you could only give to someone by standing next to them and saying, "Listen." That's the sound of getting it right. And if you heard it, really heard it, you'd never forget it. Just like the men who served with Harold Grimes never forgot him, even when the world did. Even when the world looked at a 74-year-old man with a cane and khaki trousers and saw nothing worth paying attention to. The men who knew him, the men whose lives he saved by keeping their trucks alive, they knew. They always knew. And now you know too. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that real heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they carry a cane and a pocket screwdriver and 50 years of knowledge that the world almost forgot to ask for. Hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Because there are more of them out there. More quiet men and women with extraordinary pasts hidden behind ordinary faces waiting for someone to listen. All you have to do is pay attention.